Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us online today. My name is Ploy at IISD. I'm a scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute and coordinating lead author of the Production Gap Report. I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar hosted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD, today, with an amazing lineup of 5 speakers whom I will introduce in due course. So today's webinar will provide a first look and discussion around the key findings from IISD's latest report that was released earlier today, Navigating Energy Transitions, Mapping the Road to 1.5 degrees C. The report explores what mitigation scenarios imply for phasing out oil and gas and scaling up renewables in line with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What are the barriers impeding this energy transition, and what are the tools and solutions governments and financial institutions can employ to navigate the current energy crisis while maintaining climate ambition? So before we begin, I just have several housekeeping items to share. Firstly, this event is being recorded. Secondly, the agenda for today is as follows. We'll spend the first 20 minutes hearing about the report's key findings, followed by 45 minutes of panel discussion, and end with a 20-minute Q&A session, which means that throughout the webinar, I invite you all in the audience to type any questions that come to mind in the Q&A box. Please do use that Zoom feature rather than the chat box and indicate if your question is directed to any specific panelist. You can also upvote any questions throughout the webinar you'd like to see most answered, and we'll try to get through as many of them as possible in the last 20 minutes of today's discussion. All right, so with that, let me first introduce you to our first speaker, who will take us through the key findings of the report. Olivier Bois-Vonkersk is a policy analyst working on energy transition scenarios with IISD's energy program. He served as one of the chief scientific editors of the report, and before joining IISD, Olivier worked for the United Nations Environment Program, where he coordinated the production of the UNEP emissions gap reports. Olivier, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ploy, and I'm very happy to be presenting this report today. It's been a long time coming, and it's great that we have the chance and the opportunity to share it with everyone here today. So everyone can see my screen, yes? It's good. So, so this report began with the, well, it started with the onset of the publishing of the IPCC 6 assessment report, Working Group 3, analysis. So ever since that report was published, we started digging down into the IPCC 1.5 degree scenario in order to assess what are sort of the 1.5 degree compatible energy futures. And then since then, we've also scaled up our analysis to include a broader set of 1.5 degree pathways from different organizations such as the IEA, ARENA, but also Bloomberg Energy Finance and other consultancy. We even included analysis from fossil fuel companies to see what do they say about 1.5 degree compatible energy futures. So IEM are really useful to assess climate policies for a few reasons mainly. So first is that because they influence the expectations of energy producers, energy consumers, but also investors and policymaker global energy supply outlook. So these expectations then contribute to steer energy producers' investment decisions and also financial actors' assessments of the trend in the energy market. So for this reason, we decided to have a broad look at a large number of climate and energy pathways to outline what is needed based on this assessment for limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we've done so, as I stated, with a selected set of pathways that are published in the IPCC Scenario Explorer, and also compare that with other authoritative, most used pathway in the literature, in academia, in the intergovernmental organization, and different consultancies. So one of the challenges working with integrated assessment model is sometimes that they use large-scale carbon sequestration in order to sequester emission over the forthcoming decade, either through different technologies like fossil CCS or by having negative emission through carbon dioxide removal technologies. So from the 100 scenarios that the IPCC published that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we've applied different feasibility and sustainability criteria to select the one that met the IPCC feasibility concern or threshold on the deployment of these technologies. So therefore, that led us to filter out some scenario that included level of fossil carbon capture and storage that are above 3 gigaton per year by 2050, or level of BECCS that are beyond 3.8 gigaton per year by 2050. And same thing for the carbon sequestration through afforestation and reforestation. So the IPCC also stated that the maximum sustainable potential for this deployment are about 3.6 gigaton. So then that left us with a subset of 26 pathways from which we've extracted medians for different components of the energy transition. And one of the first things that we've looked at, or that I'm going to present today, is the 1.5 degree consistent oil and gas phase-out pathways. So most of you all know probably, the IEA last year for the first time published 1.5 degree compatible energy scenarios in its net zero emission scenario. So over here, I'm representing the oil and gas production volume that are consistent with this scenario by the IEA. And it shows a pretty steep decline in oil and gas production, which concluded that there should be no room for new oil and gas development based on these pathways. And here is our rate of production decline from the selected IPCC 1.5 degree pathway that we've extracted from the Scenario Explorer, showing that basically the rate of decline is similar, although a bit faster over the coming decade. And so the reason why there's no room for new oil and gas development under these pathways, because as we've shown here in gray, this is the embodied carbon emission from all the fields that are already producing or under development today. So stating that by themselves, these fields would be enough to consume the entirety of the allocated carbon budget for the oil and gas sector. So meaning that any new fields or any new exploration would come in excess of what these pathways indicate the world should be able to consume to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So re-emphasizing the conclusion that there's no room for new oil and gas development under their scenarios. So then, as I stated earlier, we've compared these pathways with a broader set of scenarios from the literature. And basically, our conclusion is that all these major scenarios confirm the IEA conclusion that there's no room for new oil and gas development. So as you can see here, they all show pretty steep decline in oil and gas production, expressed in the gigaton of CO2 emission. And then some pathways we see go a bit faster. So for example, the One Earth climate model, which has about 99% reduction of oil and gas. It doesn't include any fossil carbon capture and storage, nor any BECCS, which is why it phased out production a bit faster. So we've also found in the analysis that oil and gas phase-out pathway are extremely sensitive to hypothesis and assumption made in model on the rate of deployment of carbon sequestration technologies such as fossil CCS or CDR. So that's why also the top line, the green one from BP Net Zero, also has level of fossil CCS that are above the IPCC threshold for the feasibility of the deployment of that technology. But overall, we see that all scenarios show an at least 65% reduction in oil and gas production by the middle of the century. So to enable phasing out oil and gas production at this rate, we obviously need to phase in wind and solar deployment radically faster than what is actually forecasted. So the stacked area chart in the bottom here shows the projection for wind and solar capacity addition annually. And our assessment of selected IPCC and IEA 1.5 degree pathway show that the annual capacity deployment needs should be about 2.5 times higher than current forecast for wind capacity addition by 2030, and about 50% higher for solar capacity deployment by 2030, compared to current forecast. However, our analysis of other pathways and 1.5 degree compatible scenario show that these estimates could be up to 3 times higher in other models. So just stating that our assessment of the consistent level of investment that is required to deploy the required infrastructure need for wind and solar are relatively conservative, depending on which scenario do we use. So speaking about these investment needs, we've assessed that by 2030, investment in wind and solar alone should be about 830 billion per year for this technology alone. However, we show that the investment forecast, or the expected investment in wind and solar technology by 2030, only expected to reach less than 400 billion per year. So this leaves an investment gap of about 450 billion by the end of the decade. However, we also assess sort of what are the expected level of investment in the new oil and gas fields that are incompatible, according to analysis, with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We find that actually the investment gap for wind and solar technology is smaller than the investment forecast in all the new oil and gas fields and exploration that are incompatible with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that basically states that there's no lack of capital for the energy transition globally, but rather that investment are still massively going to the wrong places, namely into new oil and gas infrastructure and exploration projects. So then we've also assessed what are like the main barriers for navigating the energy transition. And one of them is, of course, the war in Ukraine, as it has many implications for the energy systems globally. So as we all know, gas prices in Europe have increased drastically over the past year, and this unfolding energy crisis, mainly in Europe, but also globally, has required sort of a rethink on how energy production and consumption is conceived in Europe. So even leading some governments, some European leaders to seek for more oil and gas export capacity, and even scoured Africa for new fields. And so this led us to assess sort of what is Europe gas consumption at the moment, and showing that in the existing field that are already in Europe produce about 200 billion cubic meter per year. And then through the import capacity from the Middle East and Africa, as well as from the Azerbaijan existing fields, it adds another 100 billion cubic meter per year. And with the current LNG import infrastructure that Europe has, which is about 500 billion cubic meter of annual consumption per year. So then if we phase out the Russian oil and gas supply due to all the current sanctions that are being imposed on Russia and the shutting down of the Nord Stream pipelines, we find that nevertheless, if Europe is to follow a 1.5 degree aligned gas consumption pathway, then Europe would not need any new import infrastructure. So basically the current import infrastructure is more than enough to fulfill European gas consumption that is aligned with 1.5 degrees Celsius, apart from a short-term supply crunch in 2022 and 2023. However, this short-term supply crunch cannot be met by developing new fields, as a new gas field typically takes about 3 to 5 years to be developed from the first exploratory wells until it starts producing commercially. Otherwise, we've also assessed sort of what are the other barriers in terms of creating enabling environment to accelerate the energy transition. And especially in terms of phasing out oil and gas production, we find that investment treaties are creating a huge barrier, for enabling government to set ambitious enough oil and gas phase-out policies. So an assessment of investment treaties globally find out that actually the fossil fuel industry holds government hostages a bit to investment state dispute settlement, which could cost government up to 340 billion if they were to implement oil and gas phase-out policy that are consistent with the 1.5 degree target. Moreover, these investment treaties also create the moral hazard from fossil fuel company by insulating them from stranded asset losses. So effectively, these investment treaties are guaranteeing the revenues to oil and gas company, opening new fields in certain geographies where investment treaties are in place, which then sort of safeguards them from any potential losses due to more ambitious or stringent oil and gas phase-out policies or climate policies, or just changes in the energy market. So that's why we conclude that significant reform or outright withdrawal of investment treaties are needed to align with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And actually, we've seen lately governments of Poland, Netherlands, Spain, and just last week, France, all announcing that they would pull out from the Energy Charter Treaty, which is one of the biggest investment treaty protecting oil and gas companies worldwide, stating that basically the modernization reforms that are currently undergoing are far from insufficient to meet these government concerns. And moreover, we also looked at an assessment of net zero pledges to see that basically they lack significant scope and scale in order to be credible and consistent with the 1.5 degree target. So from analyzing fossil fuel industry transition plans and net zero target, we find that they generally tend to be really vague and also sort of non-committal long-term intention rather than implementation and short-term target. So one of the reasons why that we find that this is the case is because usually the targets are don't include the full scope of emissions. So basically, they're typically emission intensity targets, so that basically only focuses on the emission from the production of oil and gas and excluding the emission that are associated with the combustion of the stuff that's dug out of the ground. And in the fossil fuel industry, then the combustion of the fossil fuel represent about 85% of the emission from the sector. Moreover, there's also a lack of transparency in terms of specifying where are the emission reduction are coming from. So most of the time we find that there's inadequate specification on whether the emission will be reduced from the oil and gas companies' operation themselves, or they expect different reduction from down the supply chain. And this creates much problem into assessing sort of the credibility of their target and whether they have real sort of capacity to implement their emission reduction as stated in their net zero target. And finally, they also tend to rely on contentious offsetting practices, so meaning forest offset to compensate for the emission, or on unproven technology at scale, such as fossil carbon capture and storage, which in some scenarios are 3 times, 4 times the level of feasible deployment that the IPCC judges to be feasible. So that enables them to not have deep emission reduction in the short term. And actually, we also observed that production volume tend to increase in the fossil fuel companies' net zero target, which is obviously incompatible with our assessment of the climate models presented here in this analysis. So this leads me to my conclusions and key policy recommendation from our assessment of multiple energy scenarios found in the literature. So the first one that I've mentioned a few times in this presentation is that government should prevent developing any new oil and gas field and have a moratorium of licensing any new fields as well in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So our analysis of selected 1.5 degree pathways from the IPCC actually shows that by the end of this decade, oil and gas production should decrease by 30% already. And all of the major pathways that we analyzed showing at least 65% reduction by the middle of the century. So to enable phasing out oil and gas at this rate, government should provide better support for wind and solar policies. So we find that actually forecasts are far from sufficient to meet the 1.5 degree aligned annual capacity deployment for wind. So it should be about 2.5 times higher and about 50% higher for solar compared with the forecast. And financing this energy transition will also require government to create enabling environment to redirect capital flows from both the private and for both the public and the private sector into the energy transition. So the 450 billion investment gap that we found for wind and solar is actually just a fraction of the whole investment that needs to be invested in also supply, storage, transmission lines. And but in the meantime, we find that the oil and gas industries is expected to spend 570 billion per year by 2030 in new fields and new developments. So again, really showing the need to redirect capital flows away from fossil fuel and towards the clean energy transition. Moreover, we also find that the current energy crisis that's experienced mainly in Europe, but also throughout the world due to high energy prices, cannot be tackled by increasing the reliance on gas. This is simply for the reason that the 1.5-degree aligned gas consumption pathways can be met with the existing import infrastructure in Europe, and that developing new fields actually would take longer than it would be sufficient to meet the short-term supply crunch over the forthcoming years. Moreover, we also find that one of the big barriers to phase out oil and gas production are these investment treaties, which we find needs to be urgently reformed or repealed in order to allow government to enforce 1.5-degree compatible production volumes of oil and gas. And then we also assess this net zero corporate target, finding that government should better regulate them and actually implement mandatory reporting requirement eventually, but until mandatory requirements are enforced by government, investor can also fill the gap by relying on voluntary reporting methodologies. So many reporting methodology already exists to align with 1.5 degrees Celsius, and they help financial institutions to navigate the energy transition and identify clean energy investment opportunities. So on this, I thank you all for attending this webinar today, and you can always send me an email if you need more questions, or just send any of your question in the Q&A box. So on this, I pass back the mic to Ploy.
Thank you very much, Olivier, for that terrific overview. Can I just ask someone on the IISD team to share a link to the report in response to one of the questions that just came in? Okay, and let me now introduce our four panelists today. We have Dr. Ala Al-Qudaji, who is a senior scientist at the Technical Support Unit of the Working Group 3 of the IPCC and a research fellow at Imperial College London. His research focuses on climate integrated assessment modeling, international climate change cooperation, and national climate policies. Ala served as a reviewer of the report. Next, we have Diala Hawila, who's a program officer at the International Renewable Energy Agency. At IRENA, she has managed, coordinated, and co-authored reports related to renewable energy policies and benefits, and engaged with various countries in capacity building workshops on this issue. And Diala was an author of Chapter 4 of today's report. Next, we have Frederick Hans, who's a climate policy analyst at the New Climate Institute, whose work focuses on tracking climate action at the national, subnational, and corporate level. He has been a contributor to the UNEP Emissions Gap Report series since 2018 and served as an author of Chapter 5 of today's report. And finally, we have Jana Kopeniak, who is a global technical specialist in energy at the United Nations Development Programme. Jana advises developing countries worldwide on climate and energy finance and partnership building with financial institutions, private sector, climate funds, and other stakeholders to support countries' efforts towards low carbon energy and economy transformations. So to start off this panel discussion, I'll pose a question to each of our panelists today, and they'll have 5 minutes to respond before we open it up to a group discussion. So Ala, the first question is for you. Can you reflect on what this new report means for the broader field of research related to climate mitigation modeling? Maybe touch upon some of the scenario features and how these should inform energy policies for achieving the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much, Ploy, and thanks, Olivier, for the great presentation and the team for producing such a great contribution to the literature. Yeah, I mean, I guess what the report shows, it builds up on some of the scenarios that were assessed during AR6 of Working Group 3 report, and also it expand beyond that and make comparable analysis of international institutions such as IEA, IRENA, and so on. And I guess what it shows is that despite the variety of the models that produced all these scenarios with their different structural underpinning, with the different conceptual underpinning, the different assumptions, when you refine the criteria of the assessment to 1.5 degree pathways, when you set a specific criteria for sustainability and feasibility in terms of CDR, in terms of CCS, they all point toward the same directions almost. In terms of high reduction rates of fossil fuel in the near and the medium term, in terms of doubling, tripling, or quadrupling, in some cases, the level of deployment for renewables, and the really needed shift in financing from fossil fuel towards renewables. And the financing is there, right? So the issues in shifting this financing is mostly institutional governance issues, as opposed to availability of the funds to shift from fossil fuel to renewable sector. So I think there's a lot of convergence despite the different models that actually kind of created all these scenarios.
Thank you for that. And yeah, on that note, that's a great lead into the question I have for Diala, which is, as Ala mentioned, and as the report pointed to, we need to massively increase wind and solar capacity and investments worldwide. What actions do you think are needed to speed up renewable energy deployment, and how can this scale up, bring a sustainable response to the current energy security crisis?
Thank you, Ploy. And I want to also echo Ala's comment about the report and how comprehensive it is at addressing these very important issues in a very timely way. So just to answer your question, at IRENA, we analyze the policies needed for the energy transition in a very comprehensive way. So we look at the deployment policies that will support the deployment of the technologies directly related to producing renewable energy and energy efficiency solutions, of course. But we also look at the enabling policies that will help create the enabling environment to attract those investments, as has been mentioned. One of the enabling policies we focus on is designing renewable energy targets that are ambitious and that help achieve objectives of countries beyond climate, such as energy security, socioeconomic benefits, or energy access as well. And also the design of targets in a way that is context specific to every country with regards to their resources available, with regards to their infrastructure, and also other factors. Another category of policies we look at is integrating policies, which is more relevant to solar and wind or variable renewable energy, so that we can integrate them into the energy system, into the economy, the society, and then the planet as a whole. So later on, when we talk about the recycling of or end of life of technologies, this is how we are integrating those technologies within the whole ecosystem. So just starting with targets at IRENA, we did an exercise to quantify the already active targets for renewable energy by 2030. And we find that by quantifying all of them and adding them all up, we see that the world is aiming for 5.4 terawatt of added capacity by 2030. Whereas if you look at our 1.5 degree scenario, by 2030, we need to be at 10.8 terawatts. So we're already aiming for half of what we should be aiming for, which means that we need a massive increase in ambition when it comes to designing our targets. So when we look also at how those targets, so we already compared those targets to where we need to be, but also comparing those targets to our historical trends, especially with the increased competitiveness of solar and wind mainly, we see that in 2020 and 2021, we installed around 260 gigawatts of installed capacity. But if we look at the targets that are already in place, we are aiming for only 256 gigawatts per year. So already our ambitions are even not only less than what we should be, they're even less than what we have been doing in the past 2 years. So this shows the massive increase, massive need for an increase in ambition. Also, by looking at those targets, we see that they are heavily concentrated in few regions. Just like investments, when we break down the investments by region in the last couple of years or 10 years, we see a consistent concentration of investments and also ambition in a few regions and a few countries that can afford to deploy renewable energy. We see that in targets out of the total 5.4 terawatts targeted by 2030, we see 2.6, so almost half, is targeted in Asia, mainly China and India. We see 1.2 in Europe and 0.9 in North America. So this takes us to only 3% of global targets are in the MENA region, and only 2.6% are in sub-Saharan Africa, which is the region that is mainly, that is the most in need of renewable energy technologies. So we talk about the energy security in the European context, but we have seen this deficit and this shortage in the rest of the world for many years. And unfortunately, the progress is not as fast as it should be, neither to put the world on a 1.5-degree pathway, nor to supply access or reliable access that can help the socioeconomic development of countries. So now looking at the integrating policies, and this one example of how we have been designing policies the very wrong way, and not that in a way that does not support the move of investments from fossil fuel to renewable energy, is that renewable energy investments are still not attractive. And the reason for that, the main reason for that, as was mentioned by Ala, is the whole political and policy environment. So for example, if we look at the power market design, we see in the last 2 years, two crises, the COVID crisis and now the energy crisis. And in both cases, in the first cases, we saw very low demand and very low prices. And the second case is very high demand or low supply and very high prices. And in both scenarios, the renewable energy industry was not favored. So in the first case, the low prices, of course, when we're looking at marginal costing markets, the low prices made renewable energy investments unattractive. And now the high prices leading to taxing windfall profits is also making renewable energy investments not attractive. At a time where governments are still subsidizing fossil fuels in every segment of their value chain, making them a very profitable investment. So we still have this to look at. And the last point I want to now mention before we move on to our discussion is the deployment policies. So beyond the power market designs, we say in IRENA, one of the solutions to this power market design that is not designed for renewable energy is to go for a dual procurement mechanism where renewables end with a power purchase agreement with a fixed price over 20 years. So what happens is that we are using competitive procurements to reach those PPAs. And in those competitive procurement mechanisms, we have been focusing mainly on the price. And this was tackled in the chapter in the report, where all the countries, most of the countries, focus the design of their competitive procurement on price, whereas they can be focused to achieve many other objectives, among them the localization of supply chains, which is very important for energy security. So also we need to shift this focus and this obsession on price when it comes to renewable energy, since we even don't have it in fossil fuels, and help the industry develop locally, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Diala, for that terrific intervention. And very relatedly, Jana, can you kind of share from your experience, especially in working with countries, what are the main challenges and barriers you see in countries in different regions to close this investment gap in solar and wind deployment?
Thank you, Ploy, for the opportunity to join this panel. And let me start by congratulating you on the release of the report. As highlighted by the report, the annual investment gap for the required wind and solar deployment, as Olivia said, is around $450 billion until 2030, if we want to follow the 1.5 Celsius degree pathway. However, it is very clear that the current investment plans are nowhere close to such amounts. And I would want to zoom in on, I think, what were already said by the previous panelists on what are the barriers. The barriers, the first one I would want to mention to closing the investment gap through solar and wind technology is related to the capital cost. Even though lower fuel and operating costs might make solar and wind energy cost competitive, considering the life cycle, higher initial capital costs remain still an obstacle, especially for the developing countries. Renewable energy technology is also facing some countries high tax and import duties, adding to the overall cost envelope and slowing down the renewables uptake. Also, when we're talking about energy transition, that means we need to consider all segments of society and economies, from larger commercial industries, utilities to individual households, and allow them to be part of the process. This brings me to the second barrier, which is financing. The access to finance for deployment of renewables differs for each group and might be either limited or costly in some cases. For instance, market lending rates are often not sufficiently attractive or affordable for a lower income household living in a developing country, which wants to purchase a rooftop solar PV system. If we want to reach the scale we're talking also about which we're talking in the report, the energy transition must be inclusive and uptake of renewables must be among all segments of society and economy. As it was already mentioned as well, regulatory and policy barriers also remain, and we see this as a major obstacles when we work with countries across the globe. For instance, in the absence of a legal framework, independent power producers may not be able to invest into renewable energy facilities and sell power to the utility. Also, in some countries, utilities still don't allow favorable transmission access to renewable energy producers, or may charge high prices for transmission access. The next barrier, which I want to maybe reflect a bit about, is might be shorter term, but from a risk perspective cannot be excluded, as it might happen again in future. And here, as we have been observing in the last 2 years, I'm talking about the supply chain disruption, which has caused delays in implementation of solar and wind projects in most regions. On top of it, as we are observing, the prices of resources and materials such as lithium, cobalt, or nickel have doubled or more than doubled, what also got reflected in the pricing of renewable energy technology, and also brought an element of uncertainty to the energy markets. Therefore, resource efficiency and recycling of materials such as in the batteries is as a must to upscale deployment of PV and wind solutions. On another note, let's look at the models. Nuclear power, coal, and natural gas are, as we know, all highly centralized sources of power. Wind and solar, on the other hand, comes with a decentralized model. So when we're talking about inclusive energy transition, looking at the case of a small island developing country, for instance, which faces hurricanes, the centralized model is already perceived more favorably, as it mitigates the risk of the overall country power shutdown in case of a well-planned solar mini-grid system. On the other hand, the need to locate the wind turbines, solar farms on pieces of land requires often negotiations, contracts, permits, and community relations. And the same applies to building transmission lines. So in case of an island, for instance, the land might be also scarce. Therefore, we need to consider these factors carefully. We also need to consider that the quality of wind and solar resources vary widely across the regions or across the world. And land and time always come with a cost, and good energy planning is therefore an important factor. And the last challenge or a barrier which I would want to touch upon, and it's related to basically all the other barriers which I mentioned, is the overall country's appetite to disrupt their status quo and undergo a truly transformative change of the energy infrastructure. Every year, governments spend around $423 billion on average to subsidize fossil fuel consumption. This means that for every dollar pledged to tackle the climate crisis for the world's poor, $4 are spent on fossil fuel subsidies that keep the same crisis alive. As a result, the renewables are not entering an equal playing field, but must compete with industries that are both directly and indirectly subsidized. What I mean by this, directly in form of direct budgetary transfers, tax incentives, leases, and so on, but also indirectly by not punishing those who pollute and by governments not putting adequate price on carbon. To conclude, maybe on a positive note, I would like to say that for each of these barriers, there is a solution, and it is just a matter of determination and political will to further the risk the markets for renewables. Over to you, Chloe.
Thank you, Jana. Those are just some really important points, and we'll definitely pick up on those threads in the group discussion later on. But maybe picking up on that one thread you shared about hesitation to disrupt the status quo, I think that's maybe a good tie-in for the question I have for Frederick. thinking about the role of the private sector now, the fossil fuel industry. Chapter 5 of the report shows how corporate net zero strategies are often disconnected from climate science. Where do you see the biggest opportunities and barriers to reforming these corporate long-term targets? And are there low-hanging fruits for investors to ensure that these targets can help to accelerate rather than hinder global decarbonization?
Yeah, thanks, Ploy, for this interesting question, and congratulations everyone for this for the launch of this report. Indeed, if you look at the current status quo of net zero targets, as we've done in chapter 5.3, you really see that the current state of play is inadequate. And it's inadequate for several reasons that I will quickly guide you through. But first and foremost, what we identify as the key opportunity and the key next step that needs to happen, and there's an urgent need for it, is that the requirements and definition of what net zero targets are, those need to be made kind of consistent across different regulatory approaches that are currently undertaken. We allude to a few of those in the report. So for instance, we have the high-level expert group set up by the UN Secretary General. We have different governments looking at this at the moment. And then obviously we also have some voluntary initiative like the Science Based Targets Initiative. And what we really need is that there have to be sort of consistent and really science-informed criteria how corporates should set up these targets so that they're really meaningful and are really guiding the companies towards a transition that is 1.5 degree compatible. So what do we mean in particular? What needs to improve? So first of all, we need to really ensure that these targets cover all emission sources. So a classical thing, and Olivier mentioned that before, is that companies and also big oil and gas majors, they certainly leave out emission sources. So they're downstream scope 3 emissions. So at the time the oil and gas is burned and emits the CO2, or also the upstream emissions. And that simply makes those targets way less meaningful if they only cover 20% or less across the entire value chain, as we see at the moment. The second point is that really companies need to commit to specific emission reduction targets that are 1.5 degree aligned. And this is also why this report can be so important, to really give civil society, give investors an understanding of what needs to happen to also really hold those companies accountable and question them of whether the emission reductions along their value chain are really in line with that latest science. And that needs to be crystal clear. And that also links to the third point, that companies, they need to present measures and interim steps on how they intend to meet these targets. To just pledge a visionary net zero target and do not providing any really tangible next steps and actions on how they aim to intend that towards the next 7 years, towards 2030, and then beyond towards mid-century, that is simply not okay. And then the last point is that companies really need to shift away from the contentious offsetting practices that they currently deploy, where they simply assume that high levels of offsetting that they then oftentimes even don't specify in terms of sustainability criteria, permanence criteria that they might deploy, that they really need to shift away from that and really focus on own emission reductions. So those are a few really key improvements that we would need to see over the next years in order to really strengthen those targets and make them really meaningful in guiding the transition, particularly for the oil and gas majors that recently have really jumped on that bandwagon that are these net zero pledges. And we really need to ensure to strengthen that and make those more robust, that they become meaningful.
Thank you, Frederick. And yeah, thank you to everyone for those really terrific interventions. I'd now also like to bring in Olivier and open things up to a group discussion. So maybe picking up what you said, Frederick, about the problematic offsetting practices of companies, maybe Olivier, and then also Ala, could you reflect on the role of carbon capture and storage, or CCS, and carbon dioxide removal and CDR technologies in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and why may those require some caution?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to get things started on that question and provide some element of answers. So one of the reasons why we decided to filter IPCC published scenarios based on the feasibility and sustainability criteria of CDR and CCS is that basically these technology have been for the past 20 years riddled with cost overrun, cancellation projects, and it's a technology that's not yet really matured or haven't been demonstrated at scale so far, nor is it really economically feasible to do that at current energy prices. So we consider that modeling gigantic amount of carbon removal technology that do not really exist today is less realistic than undertaking effort to phase out oil and gas production with that can be sort of replaced by wind and solar technology, which are already cost competitive and demonstrated at scale, and also have consistently beaten expectation in terms of their level of efficiency and cost decreases over the past couple of decades. And today, actually, or at the time of the publication of the report, there was only about 26 large-scale commercial carbon capture and storage projects online today. And actually only 8 of them are dedicated to long-term carbon sequestration, and all the rest are actually used for enhanced oil recovery. So it's a process that actually uses the captured carbon and then inject it back into wells in order to increase reservoir pressure so they can then extract more oil and gas from their reserves. So it's not really a technology that enables to sequester more carbon on a net basis. Yeah, so this is, I think, currently like the scale, well, the status with carbon sequestration technology and why we need to be careful and how do we treat them in models and as they drive expectation of energy producers.
Hala, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Olivier covered it well. I mean, from our perspective, the need for CDR technologies or CDR measures, I mean, first of all, to assess these measures, we already use some level of CDR, which is in land use CDR, land use based CDR, but it is in no way used at the scale that some of these assessments or some of these models tell us would be needed in the future. The other CDR measures that are currently speculative or we don't have strong proof of concept for, they are very costly, and we're not sure whether they will be able to scale at the level that we are assuming will be needed. And overall, as we scale the level of deployment of CDR, it is very important that we need reporting, monitoring, and verification mechanisms in place on the national level, but also on the international level. And I mean, these will prove very difficult and very contentious to approve in the international settings. And of course, CDR has wide system implications on food and water security, but also in terms of land use, as the report rightly highlighted. Now, I mean, CDR would be only needed initially, or the intention of CDR is only needed for hard to decarbonize sectors such as steel and cement, and this is where CDR is for. And then the other issue where CDR could be useful is we have high uncertainty in the level of the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees and for the 2 degrees pathways. So there is quite a considerable level of uncertainty there, and this is where CDR could be useful as well. But CDR is not meant to be used as a substitute of mitigation in the short and the medium term, especially when we have the technology and we have the funding for the majority of the sectors, energy, I wouldn't say industry, there are a lot of challenges, but energy, for instance, transport, housing, we have the measures there to do the decarbonization needed, as we've shown in our IPCC report, April this year. What the report here did is that filter the scenarios to these feasibility criteria, but it's also a very important exercise, which was done by the IPCC, is not to use this filter and to understand the trade-off. If we delay mitigation, what is required in terms of net negative emissions, what is required in terms of level of deployment of CDR. And this is where we see the staggering level of deployment needed in the future. And this is where it's said, okay, can we actually do that? And you bounce back to the feasibility criteria, and the feasibility assessment is like, it's beyond what we could be sustainable to deploy. So it's, I mean, it's an important tool, need to be used in specific settings, lack experience, lack institutional setting that we need to work on now, but it is in no way a substitute for mitigation.
Thank you. Yeah, unless anybody else would like to add, Frederick, would you like to add something?
Exactly. I think that is really, really important, what Allah just outlined. And this is also indeed exactly what we see and what we sort of criticize with the current practice of net zero target setting, because this is indeed what happens, right? You use offsets that are sometimes not even specified what exactly they're about. And they're used to sort of, you know, as an equivalent to do not mitigate in line with 1.5 degree. And that is, of course, highly problematic because, first of all, the action does not happen that we need to see, particularly from these big companies. And then second of all, it is also highly problematic because it creates a notion that the sector is further ahead than it actually is, right? If suddenly all those companies have those net zero targets, but they are not meaningful in terms of mitigation, but consumers do believe they are, if regulators believe they are, then we have a really big problem. And that's exactly what we're currently seeing, and why we need more stringent regulation there, and to really avoid that, because that is then really on both sides basically a really big problem if that happens at the corporate side.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really important point. And I think relatedly, you know, the report addressed kind of this European dash for gas in the midst of the ongoing energy crisis. I wonder if Diala and Jana, you could reflect on whether, you know, in the energy transition context, have you seen particularly bad or good examples of how different countries have responded to the ongoing energy crisis?
Yes, thank you, Ploy. We see, I mean, not specific countries doing one specific thing, but we see a general trend. So we see that, I mean, mainly in Europe, we see on the short term, at least, we see countries turning back on their commitments to phase out coal power plants, for example. But this is hopefully for the short term, as a short-term solution, until in the long term they increase their ambition, and as we saw in the EU Power Plan, increasing ambition for renewable energy. In other parts of the world, it's not looking very as positive. We see countries, for example, in the MENA region in Africa, increasing investments in exploration or increasing investments in fossil fuels, and even coal in a lot of the developing countries. And renewable energy still doesn't play a big role in their future energy mix.
To add to what Diala said, indeed, I think in several regions we're seeing gas supply diversification efforts to respond quickly to the crisis that several of the countries are facing. And the responses indeed differ country by country or region by region. So I would say there is no ideal scenario or no ideal way to respond to a crisis scenario. But what I think it is important is how the measures and commitments to decarbonize will be stick to in the medium and long term. Equally, in addition to increasing the share of renewables in the medium and longer term, I think it's important to also mention the importance of energy efficiency to complement the efforts to increase energy supply with measures to decrease energy intensity and manage demand. Because we need to keep in mind that the cheapest energy is the one we don't use. Energy efficiency is a source of energy in itself, inexhaustible and basically available everywhere. And these efforts we can also see happening across Europe, which is the most directly hit by the energy crisis. And I'm pleased to say that also UNDP is providing technical support to the governments to accelerate energy efficiency market development in a number of sectors, including for public and residential buildings. Thank you.
And yeah, maybe just someone can indicate if they'd like to take this. I think, you know, developing countries especially face great challenges to decarbonize, and I'm curious if someone can reflect on what could in particular enable them to leapfrog from fossil fuel development to renewable energy in an equitable and just manner. Diala, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just have a few things that I can share from Irina's veto. So as you may know, in the World Energy Transitions Outlook, Irina says that the energy transition brings many benefits in terms of GDP, jobs, and welfare. Now, the way that the benefits are, or the way the impacts are positive. So obviously this is on a global level, but when we look at the numbers on a regional or country level, of course, not everybody is a winner. But the way we can maximize the benefits, or the way we can make sure that we have more winners than losers, is through what we call a policy basket. And it's mainly through international collaboration. So international collaboration at many levels. The first one, obviously, is technology exchange and capacity building. But of course, another one is on the financial level. For example, one example of this just transition framework is what is now in South Africa, supported by many governments from the global north, where we can support the energy transition in a just and inclusive way through the transfer of funds that can help create an enabling environment for the energy transition in a just way. So by that, we mean when we have public investments, it's not only directly in renewable energy projects, it's also in the whole enabling environment that can make these projects, that can help maximize the benefits to the communities and the societies and the countries at large.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just thought to complement that from our assessment as well. I mean, of course, one way or two ways to enable developing countries transition is financing transfer and technological transfers. And what we saw in our assessment, what we did is we looked at the flows of financing to enable the transition and the needs for financing. And what we see is that in Eastern Asia and in developing countries in Africa and in the Middle East, there is 5 to 12 times gaps in terms of the flow currently going into the transition versus the need to achieve a 1.5 degree aligned or pathways, for instance. And this could be enabled, of course, by international transfers and cooperation via platforms such as the UNFCCC and COPS and so on.
Thank you. Frederick, I wonder if you had any thoughts on the role of the fossil fuel industry in helping to enable a just and equitable transition. I'm not sure if, you know, does that feature at all in net zero targets?
No, we haven't really identified that, and I think also the way they are actually specified today do not allow to include or assess that, right, in a way, because there has been such a rush to set those up, and they are poorly defined at present. But that's certainly also something to include. I would perhaps like to quickly combine that with a question that I think we've seen in the Q&A chat, where there was a question, yeah, but what to do if governments do not regulate them appropriately, right? Like, so what are means to kind of force companies to do that? And I think first and foremost, as I mentioned before, the regulation is key, right? Like we need that. It is on the agenda, right? We see it at the moment, and hopefully that happens. But we also have seen, and we also touch upon that in chapter 5.3, is there are also other means, right? We've seen several court cases recently against also oil and gas majors. Obviously, the most prominent one in the Netherlands last year, where there was a first court ruling of the Dutch district, or the Hague District Court against Shell, where they now have to reduce net 45% below 2020 levels across all 3 scopes. So that indeed includes the entire emissions. So there is this legal action that can be taken up, and then obviously there are also other measures where civil society and investors are very active, right, and really engage also directly with those companies to really enhance their targets, make them more transparent, make them better understandable and more aligned with 1.5. So there are different ways of doing that and making them more stringent and more ambitious. But at the end of the day, at least from our point of view, regulation in the end is key, because it cannot just be based on sort of voluntary actions by civil society or also investors, but also the regulatory framework needs to be there, similarly as we have it with financial statements of corporates, right, where this is also heavily regulated and not just left for companies to define themselves.
Yeah, great point. Thank you. Maybe turning now, looking ahead, COP27 is starting in a couple of weeks. I wonder if Olivier and Jana, you could kind of briefly reflect on how you think energy scenarios, but also just the wider implications of the report we've been discussing today can and should feature in the debates there, and how can we ensure that the implications are reflected in the outcomes at COP27? Olivier, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to have a first stab at this question, and I think this also will address some of the comments that I've seen in the Q&A box regarding equity consideration and how the adequate burden sharing for phasing out fossil fuel production. So as we've shown in the report, we show global pathways, right? So that are sort of averages of the global oil and gas production that needs to decrease overall. However, it's important to understand that high-income countries with a low dependence on their oil and gas production should actually be phasing out their oil and gas production faster than the sort of baseline global pathways that we've shown. So I think it is very key to reflect for equitable, but also fair and differentiated responsibilities and different capacities, that G20 countries should actually phase out their oil and gas production faster, and also potentially leave more time for low-income countries that are highly dependent on their oil and gas production to have a bit more time to phase out their oil and gas production, also for their concerns in terms of their energy security and deployment. So we're not advocating for any new fields anywhere, neither, but the rate of production should clearly be faster in high-income countries that are less dependent on the production. So that, yeah. No, go ahead, Jana.
I think energy scenarios shall be a hot topic at COP27. And the reason for it is that the international situation has significantly changed since COP26. And this is especially because of the energy crisis. I think what we have discussed ahead of COP26 is a completely different context as we're discussing now. And many states have turned to what I would call quick win fossil fuel-based solutions to fill in the energy supply gap in the shorter term, while still committing to a longer term decarbonization efforts. So I think really the question, and I think this report helps to shed some light on many of the important topics, is how will the energy crisis impact decarbonization efforts in the medium and long term? Thank you.
And yeah, did anyone want to add? I think Ella, yes.
Thank you. Thanks. Just to compliment Olivier and Diana, I mean, what we see from our experience in approving the summary for policymakers of our report, this section on scenarios and pathways has taken the highest capacity and the highest demand in our approval. If you look at our summary for policymakers, 25% of the text is on scenarios, but it took about 80% of the attention of media and policymakers. So it's already a very hot topic. It informed in the past how we meet the Paris targets or of 1.5 or 2 degrees. And what we've seen here is we've seen a lot of interest in terms of what are the intermediate targets of reducing CO2 by 2030, the dates for net zero. So all these kind of milestones and targets are very much of interest to policymakers. And one of the insights perhaps from our report that didn't come out very vividly is the likelihood of achieving 1.5 degree has shifted or have been reduced between the special report of 1.5 degree and our AR6 report a few months ago. And this is only, we're talking about 4-year gap. So the likelihood was around 45% in 2018 and now shifted to around 38%. And that's because we are continue to build up our emissions, even though in special report 1.5 degrees and in this report we're saying essentially you need to start reducing emissions immediately and rapidly, and the time is now. So it's very informative for the debate, very contagious from our experience during our approval sessions, and and I hope that the policymakers will take it more seriously this time.
Thank you, Ala. Diala, did you have any thoughts on, from the renewable energy side, kind of any specific COP outcomes you'd like to see reflected?
It's the same as what we have been seeing in the past years. Of course, totally agree with Yana. This COP is going to be very different. We hope to see even more increased ambition, and it's not only because of climate, as Yana mentioned, it's because of the obvious reasons. But the question is, for the rest of the world, for the rest of the developing world that has been living in energy deficit for so long, what's taking them so much time to move towards an energy transition based on renewables? What's taking them time to increase their ambition in a source of energy that is localized, that can create so many benefits, that can democratize access to energy? And it brings us all back to the same answers. The way the policy or the legal framework has been designed, the structural dependencies that all societies have. So we have the energy transition is way more complicated than a technological transition. We're not just going to replace one technology with another. We're going to, as Yana mentioned, there's a decrease in consumption. So we're going to change the way we consume. We're going to become also passive. We're going to move from being passive consumers to also being active producers. And we're also going to interact with the energy system and help the energy system with the energy transition. But structural changes go also beyond that. We talked about the market design, but also there is this shift towards localizing value chains and the way we use the materials that also was previously mentioned today. That's also going to take more time than just saying that we're going to deploy volumes and just going for it. And sorry, just one thing that I think we all have not mentioned before, which is also very crucially important, it's skills, the availability of skills. So we are seeing lack of skills needed in the whole energy transition everywhere. I mean, in Europe, we don't have enough installers to install the projects at scale. Even if we get the permits for projects, we see that there is a delay because of the lack of installers. And this is also obviously the case in developing markets. But in order to develop the skills, in order for people to be interested in working in renewables and going towards this field, we need to show them that jobs in renewable energy are stable and are lucrative. But so far, we don't show them that, because we see we are all looking at the same news, and we see that although the renewable energy industry employs 12 million people today, we continuously keep seeing even the largest companies laying off people in a massive scale. So for people who are now getting into the job market, why would they choose to work for renewable energy when it's not very secure, it's not very lucrative, it's not very high paying compared to other industries? So also we need to the structural change also needs to also go on the capacity building side to build the skills and the capacity needed, not only for installing solar PV, but also also for solar PV or wind or installing technologies and maintaining them, but also for recruiting and for retaining people who can help in the innovation and the whole systemic approach of this energy transition and the way it should be.
Thank you, Diala. Yeah, so I think in the last 20 minutes, we'll turn to the questions that have been coming in from the audience. You had briefly touched on this, Olivier, but I think, you know, it is an important and nuanced discussion, and the question's gotten a lot of upvote. So I'm going to ask you, Lamiz Omarji, who asked, the report indicates that the global south countries should leapfrog oil and gas and move straight to using renewables. But many African governments and companies see oil and gas as a key to the development and economic growth. And in South Africa, gas is pushed as a key transition fuel, which is needed to keep the power system stable before other cleaner alternatives become viable. Does the report take into account these arguments? And should African countries be pursuing oil and gas even as a temporary measure of development?
And that is indeed a good question, and a shared concern for many lower-income countries or developing economies that are still relying on fossil fuel. However, the climate assessment of what can be produced in terms of fossil fuel fields, especially oil and gas, show that this is not consistent. I mean, opening any new oil and gas field or increasing global production will not be consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, moreover, gas should not be considered as a transition fuel, simply because it still has very high level of carbon emission if we include sort of the fugitive methane emission from the production of gas. And wind and solar technology are already mostly more cost competitive than new gas development, especially abated new gas development. So there is a high level of capacity actually to leapfrog in most lower income countries and developing economies by investing more rapidly in wind and solar project. And so sometimes it's a matter of some capital cost and higher interest rates. And these are issues that can be tackled by decreasing the risks of these investment, by including multilateral development bank in the projects, or with international finance that also needs to flow more from the Annex 1 country to the Annex 2 countries, so from the rich countries to the more developing countries. So it is key to have that transfer of finance as well, as stated in the Paris Agreement, to facilitate a transition where there are still barriers to having more cost competitive wind and solar technologies.
Thank you. I think Jana, you had your hand up, and then Diala.
Thank you, Ploy. I think Lami's really raised a very important question. And as we all know, there are many countries, and not only in this region, that are really heavily dependent, and their economies are built on fossil fuels, with or without the subsidies that they would be providing for their markets. In most cases, they do. And we know that fossil fuel subsidies in general, for instance, they really constitute an unequalizing tool. They also represent a significant share of the income of the poor, that otherwise would be paid for energy consumption in many cases. So what it really means is that a reform or transformation or a change, if it will be poorly designed, can be much more harmful for poor and vulnerable people and segments of society, and even to lead to social unrest, as we have seen in several parts of the world, being Chile in the most recent year, or Iran. And strengthening social protection systems and developing fair compensation schemes to protect against basically price increases are central to promoting more socially and politically acceptable outcomes. And on top of this, it's not only about planning, but it's also about effective public communication and deep stakeholder engagement that are key success to a really meaningful energy transition. We need to understand how the markets work, who is the vulnerable, and who might be impacted, and plan well ahead in order for us to be then able to switch to a different path right? So I think it all requires a strong political commitment, willingness to communicate, willingness to understand, for us to be able to move forward smoothly in all parts of the world. Thank you.
Just to complement what Jana said and also Olivier, so this transition towards gas, I mean, gas is for all the reasons that were mentioned, gas is probably not a transitional solution, because apart from technology, nothing transitions. It's still the same system of exploration, of distribution, of utilization, of paying for energy. It's still within the same system. We're just replacing one source with another. But the energy transition based on renewables can really lead to the democratization of energy, whereby the users become involved in the value chain, either as manufacturers, as installers, as distributors, as also as producers of energy. So the benefits will be shared more equitably, and the power or the hand on energy will be distributed among people, among communities, which also answers one of the questions that is on the Q&A, is what are the views on distributed solar energy generation? Of course, technologically, there are some challenges with integrating distributed solar PV within the grid if we are in a system where we are connected to the grid. But distributed solar energy brings, this is what we have been saying, democratization of energy. It brings access to energy to people who either are not connected to the grids, or either are in a system where they are not receivers of energy. But it also brings people in the other side, in the supply side, that were not involved in the supply of energy, to share the profits and to share the revenues of energy that are now highly concentrated in the fossil fuel industry. We see a lot of countries that are very rich in fossil fuels, but the population still is very poor. And it's because all the revenues and all the profits are concentrated within the same people. So if we transition from oil to gas, it's going to remain the same. But if we move to a more distributed energy system where we all have a bigger role to play, then we can see a bit of a more distributional impact, a bigger distributional, fair distribution of the benefits.
Jana, did you want to quickly add something? Oh, sorry, Ala, you had your hand up. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ploy. Yeah, I'm happy to come in now. Yeah, I mean, I guess Olivier, Jana, and Tiala covered it well. I just wanted to add 2 points, I guess. First of all, what we see in our assessment, which is also covered well in the report here, is that existing fossil fuel infrastructure, the cumulative emissions from this infrastructure, if it's used at its normal lifetime rate, are sufficient to use up the 1.5 degree, overshoot the 1.5 degree carbon budget, and almost use up the entire carbon budgets for 2 degrees. So there is really no capacity for new installations. Now, the issue, of course, as many others reflected, there are benefits of transitioning in terms of side benefits, in terms of democratization, and there need be a lot of financial and technological transfers across borders. But also, what we need to remember that countries that the majority of the questions are referring to will suffer the most from climate impacts. So in the long term, these costs that are incurred now for the transition, be it which is mostly, I think, should come from transfer from rich economies to developing economies, this will save us the cost in the long term of climate damages, which is something in COP27, I think, will take a center stage, because a lot of the buildup to COP27 at the moment is focused on the loss and damage discussion. So hopefully this will gear all these discussion of financial transfers and will raise the urgency for the transfer in technology and finance.
Thank you, Ala. Let me move to another question now for Frederick. I'm going to paraphrase the question that Peter Atkins raised. Experience shows that big oil will not voluntarily divert their new fossil investments into renewable energy, how could we force them to do so? What is the role of governments here?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think in terms of the assessments of existing targets and how those targets are underpinned by transition plans, first and foremost, it's really that specifying and communicating those, that should not be voluntary, and there needs to be a high level of transparency to be achieved as a first step. Because if there's no such thing as that transparency on where those companies want to go and what they actually want to do, this is obviously highly or can be highly misleading for investors who actually want to work together with ambitious companies to do that. If they don't have that information available to them, what the company really intends to do, this is not possible. Similarly with civil society and also with regulators to really understand what is going on. And this is also why, and I said that before, why we emphasize so much that this cannot be left to the companies themselves, just specifying their targets. It cannot be a voluntary approach. It needs to be done based on stringent regulation. Then obviously the second question is, okay, what are the specific measures to take? And that is something then perhaps where there is also a wider range of options, how single companies want to specifically go for it. I think the only really important thing there is also that companies themselves, they need to prove what they actually want to achieve and how. If they cannot do that, and they do not justify how they want to reach any targets they might set, this is something where there needs to be these sort of avenues to intervene. So for instance, bringing those companies to court, as we've recently seen, being with sort of advertisement claims, right, of carbon neutral fuels, or be it with targets that really lack ambition, where one can even say and you know what they want to do and how that is informed by latest science. So then there are few entry points to do that. I think just from our point of view, having assessed the current status quo of these targets, the question of transparency and having really binding regulation of what you need to achieve and how you need to prove that you also are sort of Paris Agreement aligned, that is absolutely key. Because also, to be clear on that last point, is that there might be some companies that cannot be Paris Agreement compatible, right? Or that might be simply too late or do not have the willingness to do that. But that needs to be clear. We cannot allow those companies to hide behind a net zero smokescreen to somehow signal to society that they are when they actually are not. And that needs to be clear, because everything also flows from there, right? Investors going in and putting their money into those companies where there's actually really high ambition happening, or regulators further stepping up to really regulate and further intervene. So this is why it is so crucially important to have that problem also really sorted in the short term. And yeah, let's see how this sort of comes up also within the next weeks, once the high-level expert group of the UN will make their recommendations, once the ISO net zero guiding principles come out, to really understand, okay, where are we moving to, and is that sufficient?
Thank you, Frederick. Okay, next we have a question from Peter Newell that I will just open up to everyone. Would a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty be one way of managing a fair global phase out?
I'm happy to come briefly on this one. I mean, any mechanism, any institutional mechanisms, be it instituted by governments or by the sector or by group of companies, will help reducing, will help in the transition. And I mean, from our assessment, what we show is that in the absence of current policies and current institutional mechanisms that we have in place, for instance, the City 40 initiative, our emissions would have been about 10% higher today than otherwise. So any initiative driven by cities, driven by corporations, as long as they are legitimate, as long as they actually aim to reduce emissions, as opposed to what Frederick is saying, that we cannot verify, or they are just greenwash, to put it that way, then all that will help. But it's a system-wide transition. So we need to come at it from all aspects, from governments, from sectors, from individuals. There's no one single actor in the society across the world can do this now. We need all the roles to contribute to this transition at the moment. This is how much we are in terms of urgently to transition toward these pathways.
Thank you, Ala. Does anyone want to add anything before I move on to other questions?
Yes,
please go ahead.
Just one reflection on the fair and just transition. I think we all hear that a lot. We hear this concept a lot, but I don't think it's very clear to any of us what a fair or just energy transition means. So I think maybe also we need to have a global consensus on what a fair and just energy transition means, covering all aspects, of environmental, socioeconomic, also access to energy point of view. But I think, yeah, we all need to have a comprehensive and common understanding of just and inclusive, or just and fair, before we can move on to answering more complicated questions.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Diala. And I think, on that note, we actually are also seeing some problems with the renewable energy industry, creating potentially, extractive conditions in developing countries, right? So let me ask one question that an anonymous attendee submitted, but basically they agree that a move to wind and solar is vital, but does this expansion create other environmental or social challenges, and what is being done, or what can we do to minimize these impacts? Would anyone like to reflect on this? Jana, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ploy. Indeed, I think no action is without consequences in a way. So I think indeed in the renewable energy transition, we have to bear in mind the potential environmental and social risk that might come with it. And I think the question touches upon especially the end of life cycle. And what do we do with equipment which is broken, which cannot be used anymore? How do we use materials and resources that were used in production of equipment, be the solar PV panels or batteries, to be used for future? This is absolutely crucial question. And I think if we talk about an energy transition, we need to talk about being prepared what happens after 10, 20 years of the lifetime of solar panels, for instance. We need to prepare for this. We need to build the necessary industrial capacities to deal with these problems. And I have to say that as part of my work, where we're traveling a lot to Africa, this topic is very, very much often discussed. Because especially in Africa, the countries are discussing how can we use this opportunity and turn this into a concept of circular economy. It is a business opportunity, and it is also an absolute necessity to deal with this. And maybe just to add, and I think here it comes back to really enforcing the safeguards. It is about doing appropriate environmental, social safeguard assessments and screening. It is about understanding the risk. And this assessment should be done by irrespective of who the project developer is or who the funder of a certain project is. There should be really an enforcement of the standards to ensure that we avoid or mitigate the risk to the extent possible. And then more importantly, doing the management of the risk during the implementation of project. It shouldn't be just the lip service. There should be a really deep and thorough understanding of the risk and issues, and really responsive action to that. And that also includes gender and the potential impact on women. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And with that, we are unfortunately at time. So let me conclude this webinar by saying thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us today and for your active participation. Thank you to our amazing panelists, and thank you to Olivier and the IISD team for inviting me to moderate this webinar today. In the chat box, you'll find a link to the Navigating Energy Transitions report. Please do go check out this important contribution from IISD ahead of COP27, and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.